This is a picture of my daughter Michaela when she was 6 and 9 months old. As you can see, she was a beautiful little baby. She was born normal. She was developing typically. These are pictures that we took early on. Eyes straight to the camera, social, typically developing in all respects. And then something happened somewhere between her first and second year of life. She began to drift away from us. She was completely out of it. She was miserable. This is the face of an unhappy child, as you can see. About a year after this, we got the official diagnosis of autism. So I am clearly an interested observer of all of this, and I don't come to the diagnosis of autism as an expert. Many of us would like to believe that science is a completely rational exercise, one of relentless forward progress, solving problems in a linear way. I think one of the things that's interesting is when controversy, conservatism, denial of reality creeps into the scientific process. There actually is a large body of literature on the epidemiology of autism, over 50 published surveys over a number of countries over 4 decades, which not only gives us a reasonable sample to work with, it actually gives us a pretty broad time span. There is an expert in the epidemiology of autism who has written actively, and he's been the main reviewer of most of these surveys. This is Eric Fombone, and Eric Fombone has a point of view about what this record says. We simply lack good data to test hypotheses on secular changes in the incidence of autism. But there is no need to raise false alarms on putative epidemics, nor to practice poor science to draw attention to the unmet needs of large numbers of seriously impaired children and adults. This is his review of a number of studies in autism, and you'll notice the way he presents time trends. He portrays on the horizontal axis the year of the publication of the survey. Each survey is a point, numbered, no specificity as to the country where the survey was undertaken, and there is a measure of the reported prevalence rate in the survey. And as you can see, there is sort of an increase. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that there isn't something going on there, but it's clearly pretty foggy. I think there are several things wrong with that chart. One is when you're trying to get an assessment of trend in a specific population, you shouldn't measure the year in which a paper was published, because that paper could have taken many years to wind its way through. It could have covered children of widely varying age ranges. The most important thing is to use dates of birth. You have to deal with the problem of diagnosis of autism. If any of you who've had a child with autism are in the audience, you know that this is, that the process of getting a diagnosis actually can take a variable range of time. Sometimes you can get a diagnosis early, as early as 2 years of age. Very frequently, the diagnosis won't come in until 6, 7, 8 years of age. The average age, or the median age of diagnosis, is typically around 4 or 5 years. So if you're taking a snapshot of a prevalence rate at a given point in time, it matters a lot how old the kids are that you're looking at, because you're going to get different reliability in your rate estimate depending on the age of the cohort. So if at all possible, if you want to look at trend, you have to hold age at diagnosis constant. What happens when you do this? Well, there are 2 countries in which there are actually a large number of studies. In the UK, there have been 13 studies. In the United States, there have been 9 published prevalence surveys. And you can correct all those errors that Fombone commits. And what I've done here is to take those studies, put triangles for autism spectrum, circles for just autism, take each study that was published and take the midpoint year of birth of the children that were studied, so you can find the ages and the year span of the population. So use that as the marker for the x-axis, and then take the reported prevalence. And as you can see, there's a lot less confusion in the data. Both in the UK, you see a very clear trend in autism prevalence, both autism and autistic spectrum disorders, clearly with a spike around 1990. And in the US, you see a very similar trend with autism rates rising from very low, about 3 per 10,000 in the 60s, up to about 40 per 10,000 more recently, and autism spectrum rates much higher. One of the things that we know happened in the 1990s, we had an increase in exposure to thimerosal through childhood vaccines. The thimerosal was contained in 3 vaccines: the DPT shot, the new introduction of hepatitis B, and Haemophilus influenza B, or Hib. And during the 90s, and before that actually, several things happened. One is the DPT coverage rates went up. There had been concern and there had been controversy about DPT causing damage in kids, and so for a number of years compliance rates went down. There was a childhood immunization initiative that started in the late 80s that increased DPT rates. Hib vaccines were introduced in children over 1 year of age in the late 80s, and introduced in small children, infants, in 1991, as well as hepatitis B. So there were 3 new exposures, or 3 sources of increasing exposure, 2 of them new, one of them old. And if you just model the relationship between, and this is just a pure calculation, what the average child would have received, or a typical child would have received by 2 years, and that's the blue bars here. The thimerosal exposure went up. It went up so much that it exceeded Environmental Protection Agency safety guidelines for toxic exposure to mercury in adults, but infants were receiving more. And that exposure was parallel to the increase in the rates that we see in autism in California. It was concerning enough that in 1999, the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics declared an intention to remove thimerosal from childhood vaccines. What does the evidence say? The record shows autism rates are increasing among children born after 1990. There is no credible theory that can explain a tenfold increase in disease frequency based on genetic factors alone. I would argue something new and terrible is happening to a generation of children. And it's time we started doing something about it.
Are genes in control, or is the environment out of control? Autism is considered highly genetic, and as Mark just showed us, it looks like there may at the same time be an epidemic of autism. How do you have an epidemic of a disorder that has a strong genetic influence? Clearly, genes don't cause epidemics. Environmental factors cause epidemics. Autism has been seen by a variety of studies to be inheritable. Nevertheless, the rate is going up. How can you reconcile data suggesting a strong genetic role with data suggesting that the rate is going up? Genetics is not determination, genetics is vulnerability. This would be particularly so for many chronic disorders and disorders where there's no one gene, but even in single gene disorders there's variability that's modulated by other genes and by environmental factors, and it isn't a complete lockstep fateful thing to have genes in most in all cases in terms of rate, and in most cases for a lot of other reasons. Now, this is a slide of the data that were used to generate the notion that autism was primarily, or in some people's minds, solely genetic. It's a series of twin studies. And what you see is that there are identical twins and fraternal twins, monozygotic and dizygotic. And what you see is the concordance, which means if one of the twins has autism, will the other twin have autism? So the first thing to notice is that these studies, which are all pretty old studies that were done before these rising rates, have a lot of variability in the numbers of how much concordance there is between the two twins, ranging from 36% to 96%. And if you add it all up and average it, the mean is only 77%. It's not like if one twin has it, the other one with identical genes will also have it. So something else, genes certainly play some kind of a role, but it's not the whole story. And on the other hand, the concordance rate for dizygotic twins who don't share all the same genes ranges from 0 to 33% with a mean of 11. That's more than you would expect if it were just genetic. So this doesn't completely support. It supports a role for genetic influence, but it doesn't support a role for genetic determination. When you look at why autistic brains are bigger, 65%, or basically 2/3 of it, is from the white matter. When you have a problem in white matter, it might have something to do with the processing problems that the kids have, although we haven't been able to really test this yet. We've only identified that it's bigger. It doesn't really fit very well a neurotransmitter change, and it wouldn't be a simple gene explaining this. Well, everybody knows that genes affect all these things, but it's also true that chemicals can alter every step of the way of these chemicals that affect brain development. Autism has been considered to be a brain disorder, but what about the kids being sick? Is it just a brain disorder, or the fact that many of these children have diarrhea, allergies, a variety of physical illnesses? Are they a coincidence, or are they part of the problem? And if they're part of the problem, are they evidence of environmental influences on the disorders? Genes and environment can both affect the whole body, not just the brains, and genes usually don't work in just one place. So to look for genes that determine the brain misses out that they probably are acting somewhere else, and it also misses out that it's not just genes. There are problems which you can have where you don't handle chemicals that you're exposed to very well. We all have pathways in our liver and other parts, like the kidneys, where we get rid of chemicals, detoxify them, clear them out. And these can work better or worse in various ones of us. The effects of toxic exposures can be modulated by how well or poorly your detoxification systems work, immunity as well, and immunity can be injured by toxins. And these can affect brain chemicals, immune system, liver, digestive system, kidneys. They can affect many parts of the body. So this is an interaction of gene and environment, most likely.
We're going to talk about molecules, because when all is said and done, it's molecules that are causing autism, whether it's molecules from the environment or molecules from our genes. It's molecules. The molecular puzzle that we're going to be looking into, as we've already described, has genetic components to it, brought by mom and dad and grandparents and so forth. But also, as we see the rise in autism, it seems obvious it has environmental factors. I'm going to provide evidence that both of these factors impinge on a common piece of metabolism, the ability to transfer methyl groups, that is, single carbon atoms, from one molecule to another. Transferring one carbon atom to another is called methylation, because the carbon group is called a methyl group. And if you can't do that very efficiently, you have a problem with methylation or abnormal methylation. And I'm going to focus on one particular enzyme, methionine synthase, because our own work has led us to that enzyme as a potent target for these heavy metal environmental factors. Then there's the genetic factors. And I'm going to suggest and provide evidence that the genetic factors happen to interact with those same environmental factors. That is, that they both work on a common pathway. If you have genetic risks, then the environmental factors will be more potently expressed if you bring genetic risks there. We're all born with the same genes in all of our cells, right? The stem cells, the fertilized egg, if you go back that far, has all the genes necessary to make every cell in your adult body, hearts, lungs, livers, and so forth. That process requires that certain genes be turned on and others turned off during development. Now, what turns off genes is the methylation of the genes or the DNA. When DNA is methylated, the methylation generally silences the gene and turns it off. And if later on the methyl group is removed, the gene can come back on again, maybe at another stage of development. We hear a lot about stem cells these days, about stem cell research. Well, stem cells can be anything. They can develop into any part of your body. The way they do that is growth factors act at stages on these intermediate cells to bring them along a pathway of development toward the ultimate cell that they'll become. And as they move along, certain genes may be on or being transcribed in one case, but as they move along, under the influence of growth factors like IGF-1, those genes might be turned off and another set turned on. So growth factors, by controlling DNA methylation, can control the expression of genes and orchestrate development. We became interested in looking at the effects of metals and environmental factors that could affect this process. We realized that this pathway might have something to do with autism. We began to look at the effects of metals about a year ago. And the first ones we looked at were mercury and lead. What you're looking at here is a result of an experiment in which we're measuring the methylation of membranes, phospholipids. Now we've added increasing concentrations of the metals. So from left to right, there's higher concentrations of the metals. Now you can see as we reach a certain threshold here, we see a decrease. This indicates the potency of the metal to inhibit this process. Now you're looking here at this triangle at mercury, and in the boxes here, the effects of increasing lead. Well, these are very potent inhibitory curves. Lead is being hotly debated. There's been some recent papers, one in New England Journal, for instance, about 6 months ago, talking about maybe we have to shift the allowable level of lead because it looks like changes in IQ, i.e. decreases in IQ, are occurring at low concentrations of lead that were previously thought to be not a problem. Well, the concentrations that they're thinking about for lead are right over here. It's about halfway down this curve already. So it looks like this process might be involved in some of the neurotoxicity of these two agents here, lead and mercury. We also measured the enzyme activity, again, separate from the methylation. And when we added either mercury or thimerosal, ethyl mercury, the enzyme activity was reduced to 0. Not just couldn't be stimulated, but was reduced to 0. Now, it could come back again after a few days, but it was reduced to 0 for as long as the drug was there. The lead reduced it, but was slightly less potent, just like I showed you before. And interesting, ethanol, which of course causes fetal alcohol syndrome, also caused a very potent inhibition of this enzyme as well, and probably indicates that neurodevelopmental toxins have a broad activity here. Now, aluminum is also found in vaccines. It helps the immune response to be better. And aluminum, as you see here, also caused a decrease, but it's probably cleared from the body more quickly than the mercury is, and probably less risky, I suppose. But of interest, and maybe more esoterically, are the effects of arsenic, antimony, and cadmium. And you can see here, they're very potent. The concentrations that are causing inhibition here are readily produced by even casual exposure to these agents. So when you do urine tests where they pull metal out of kids with autism, it's not unusual to find arsenic, to find cadmium and things like that in the urine. And you don't have to be an experimentalist even doing radioactive studies. If you just add the thimerosal to these naturally growing neuroblastoma cells and look at them after a couple of days, you see they round up and they look unhappy. They're not growing very well. So we end up concluding, thinking that what happens when you inhibit methionine synthase is maybe you get ADHD. Maybe that's what that increase in ADHD back in the early 90s and late 80s was maybe a harbinger or a portend of the later autism epidemic to come, and that maybe inhibition of the methylation of DNA is more involved with developmental disorders. Now, genetic factors also play a role here, and in general what you can see is they surround methionine synthase. So that if you had a weakness due to, let's say, environmental toxins on methionine synthase, you would be at greater risk if you had a genetic-based deficiency in this enzyme that makes the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, or if you had too much adenosine because these enzymes were malfunctioning. So you can see how genetic risks can decide who gets autism in response to an environmental insult and who doesn't. Other genetic risks come from your ability to get rid of heavy metals. And this study Mark knows very well, a study by Amy Holmes and others looking at baby hair, and it showed that autistic kids are very poor at putting metals into their hair, which is more or less thought to be analogous to getting rid of the metals from the body. And there's a big difference, a big poorer difference in the autistic kid's ability to get rid of metals. And the severity of the autism was related in a more or less linear manner to how well the metals were excreted. This is probably genetically related. So what causes autism when all is said and done? By my perspective here, it's a mixture of genetic factors and environmental factors, but what they share is a common influence on the capacity for methylation and for methionine synthase activity in particular.
Most of us think that a chemical that is used in products we use every day, that ends up on store shelves, that is emitted into our air, water, and food, someone must be studying it. And actually, someone must be showing that it's safe. And indeed, the picture is much different than that. It's the opposite. It's actually quite shocking to most people to hear that. Basic toxicological information is missing for the vast majority of chemicals in commerce today. In 1997, our Environmental Protection Agency did a study which showed that about 93% of the most widely used chemicals today in commerce, ones that are emitted to our air, food, water, that are in the products we use every day, lack basic information on their toxicity. About 40% of them didn't have any toxicity information available. When our leading chemicals policy, our legislation in the United States, the Toxic Substances Control Act, came into effect in 1980, every chemical that was on the market prior to 1980 was considered safe by government. It was considered safe. Those chemicals that have come on the market since 1980 represent less than 1% by volume of the chemicals on the market today. The problem then is that government, to be able to take action on these chemicals, actually has to prove on a case-by-case basis that that chemical is linked with this illness or this disorder or this level of toxicity. By waiting for that definitive proof, by waiting for all the answers, and assuming that everything is safe until we prove it dangerous, there are costs associated with that. There are costs with not taking action on very preventable environmental causes of illness. So we take lead, for example. The U.S. economy suffers about $48 billion per year still due to decreased IQ to children caused by lead exposure. And the problem is we often focus on these short-term costs. It's going to cost us a lot to change our production, but we ignore the long-term and often much more uncertain costs of disease to health and the environment. And as Dick Deeth was showing, as we learn more and more, we learn that the things that we thought were somewhat toxic are much more toxic than we actually thought they were. So lead, we keep on lowering that safe level of exposure to lead. I can't think of a case where we thought something was dangerous and it didn't turn out to be. Those cases really don't exist. It's often the other way around. As we've heard here, the growing links between chemicals and autism, but there are growing links between chemicals and many other preventable childhood illnesses. Childhood cancer. We produced a report earlier this year for the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow that showed increasing evidence that solvents, pesticides, and certain byproducts of production, exposure to those before conception, in utero, and in childhood can increase the likelihood of childhood cancer. Childhood asthma, huge increases in the incidence of childhood asthma, 160% over the last 15 years, 30% prevalence of asthma and low head start, lost school days, enormous costs to the economy. Some of the causes, diesel exhaust, particulates, cleaning chemicals, neurodevelopmental problems, ADHD, learning disabilities. 17% of U.S. children suffer from one of a spectrum of learning or behavioral disabilities. And we're having increasing evidence that pesticides, solvents, lead, PCBs, and mercury are associated with those. Reproductive problems like low birth weight. We often don't think about low birth weight as an environmentally linked illness, but low birth weight is a major indicator of infant mortality. And there's increasing evidence that chemicals do lead to low birth weight and infertility and birth defects. We know that many of these chemicals, many of the chemicals of concern for autism, are also of concern for childhood cancer. They're also of concern for other neurological problems. They're of concern for many things. So the way forward is an appropriate chemicals policy. We need to change the way we regulate chemicals in this country and globally. So what do we need to do? We need a substitution principle. If there's a safer alternative to a potentially problematic chemical, we don't need to prove it's causing these illnesses. We need to switch out of it and into the safer alternative. This is a principle that is not pie in the sky. It's the centerpiece of Swedish environmental policy on chemicals. It's been there for 25 years. We have been able to, in a 10-year period, reduce chemical use in the state of Massachusetts by 40%, reduce emissions by 80%, and save industry $14 million. So it goes to show you, you can certainly make changes to production, you can make changes to chemicals, and not hurt the economy. It's actually good for the economy. So we need to be using science and policy much more effectively to prevent harm, rather than just figuring out how much damage we're doing to ourselves. We need to continue the study, it's critical, but we need to move from study to action to prevent these very preventable causes of childhood illness.
What I wish is that knowledge was power, because then by being here tonight and learning so much, we would have done something to protect the children. But it's not true. Knowledge is not power, not knowledge alone. The Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow is a coalition strong enough to make a significant big change in our toxic chemical policy if we all work together. The Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow has united 125 organizations and has the backing of dozens of scientists like you heard tonight. And we all joined forces 2 years ago because we came to realize that U.S. laws and policies are not protecting our health. We joined together as we learned all the new scientific evidence that's emerged in the last decade, showing that the toxic chemical soup that we live in is contributing to a rise of chronic diseases, causing suffering in both adults and children. Autism may be one of them. We believe that if we work together, we can change these laws and policies so that the world is safe to grow up in. We have written new laws that are pending before the Massachusetts legislature. One would phase out mercury-containing products. This one should have been passed by now. Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine have done it. But in Massachusetts, the companies that make and sell mercury products have blocked it so far. We need your help. We also have a comprehensive bill that would begin a Massachusetts program to replace toxic chemicals with safer alternatives, to implement the substitution principle that Joel just described. Because we have democracy, we have power in numbers. We can make new laws and policies happen. I could tell you stories from my experience of how politicians have been moved by citizens speaking up to protect public health. Politicians have even acted against the wishes of the powerful polluters. Sign up for our Healthy Tomorrow Network. We will let you know how you can work with your neighbors to get your voice heard by the legislators who represent your district. If we all do a little, together we can do a lot.
I just want to say one last thing. I am a proud father, and this is my daughter, Michaela. She's beautiful, and she's doing much, much better. But there's an important point. These are real children. They are not abstractions. And every moment, and I think Joel very eloquently described all the things that delay and cause us not to act or not to pursue science or not to take the plausible concerns seriously. Every moment we waste, we are losing time for these children. And there are hundreds of thousands of them. And it's not an abstraction. It's very real. And these kids can do better. I mean, if we believe that they're sick and they're not defective, then there is something to do. And every parent that doesn't hear about an issue, doesn't hear about an opportunity, that's an opportunity lost for a real child.